Alright everybody, let's talk about a few things you need to know before we read these two stories by St. Bede the Venerable. Hopefully this will be really quick, just about 5 minutes or so, and give you all the important info. So, the first thing we need to talk about, obviously, is who our author is. It's a guy named St. Bede the Venerable. He lived from about 672 to 735, and he was always involved in the church. So he entered a monastery at the age of 7, became a deacon by 19, and a priest by age 30. He was made a saint much later by the Catholic Church in 1899, but actually during his lifetime people called him St. Bede, so that just kind of goes to show you his reputation for being a holy man of the church. He is important to our class and our purposes because he wrote the first history of England, which we're going to call, well, not we, it is called, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. It is a lot to say, so, be careful, I guess. He is actually known as the patron saint of scholars, so maybe that can be helpful for you guys this semester as you are all scholars yourself. When and where? He was born in northeast England and he lived most of his life at the monastery in Jarrow. I want you to think about our timeline that we're talking about here. Remember, we're way back in the Anglo-Saxon period. And St. Bede's life is kind of I wouldn't say the end, but definitely the latter half of the Anglo-Saxon period, 672 to 735. This is really the time when the church is ready to get rid of all of the leftover paganism that came from different cultures, and especially from the Romans. So from this point on, really from this time in British history forward, they are going to be considered a Christian nation, and specifically it's the Catholic Church that we're thinking about here. The only time that's going to change, it's going to change a lot when we get to Henry VIII, and then obviously the importance of the church and the power of the church in society grows weaker and weaker as time marches on. So the text that we're going to read, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, ecclesiastical just means having to do with the church. So this is kind of a record of the church history, yes, but also the history of the people themselves. One important thing to note that is a test question is that this was written in Latin originally, not Anglo-Saxon, not Old English. The Latin titles there on the screen. Remember, anything having to do with the church is going to be written in Latin because it is the Roman Catholic Church, and so Latin is going to be the language of that. Basically, St. Bede's history is going to tell the story from the invasion of Julius Caesar in 54 to Bede's own time in 731 AD. So it's a long scope of time, and what he's doing is he's basically collecting the stories of the people and writing them down. One thing it's important to know is that as stories are passed down from generation to generation, a lot of times the details change. They may get fuzzier, they may be exaggerated. So we're not exactly sure how true these stories are, right? We don't know how historically accurate they are, but we are going to accept them as historically accurate and true because this is what Bede wrote down in his time. Specifically, we're going to read two stories. Both of them are about kind of church-related things, which makes sense because it's a church history. We're going to read a story called The Conversion of King Edwin and Caedmon's Hymn. So let's look at each one of those real quick. The Conversion of King Edwin is exactly what it sounds like. It's about a king, King Edwin, and how he is converted to Christianity. This shows how the Christian missionaries would have worked to convert Anglo-Saxon kings. And as you read, I want you to think about how political leaders' religious beliefs affect their countries. Look out for metaphor. There's a really beautiful metaphor that describes the Anglo-Saxon religion in comparison to Christianity. And some people that you'll meet here are Paulinus, who is a missionary, King Edwin, and then Coifi, and I've put here the king's chief advisor, but actually he's also the chief priest of that Anglo-Saxon religion. So just a little clarification there. Finally, we have Caedmon's Hymn. It's a miracle tale, which is exactly what it sounds like, a story about a miracle, and it describes how a cowherd became a poet. Cowherd is just a shepherd, but for cows. So as you read this, I want you to think about how God has given us all unique talents and abilities, and I want you to be on the lookout for Caedmon's Hymn of Praise. The Anglo-Saxon version is in your textbook, so see if you can recognize any of those words, and think about how it relates to our hymns today. There are not very many characters in this one, so you shouldn't have too much trouble. Finally, my favorite slide on these little slideshows is why. Why are we reading these? Well, St. Bede's account is truly one of the first histories of England, so if our class is truly chronological and we're starting at the beginning, we kind of have to start with St. Bede. You got to start at the very beginning. There's also really interesting information in these stories about how faith and culture interact, which is one of my main objectives for us in this unit, is to think about how religion and culture work together and work against each other. So it's interesting to read about how the Anglo-Saxon faith is different from Christianity. And then finally, I love Caedmon's story because yes, it's a miracle tale, yes, it's about poetry, but I think it also really shows how important it is to have people in your life who believe in you and call out the gifts they see in you. And hopefully you'll see that as we read Caedmon, that he has someone there who says, hey, I think you've been given a gift by God and I'm going to help you use it to the best of your ability. So that's all I think you need to know before we read these two texts. I will see you guys in class.